You are listening to Talking Star Wars. Hello, Star Wars fans. I'm Connor.
And I'm Alex.
And today we're going to talk about Star Wars. And we're going to take kind of a wide scope and take a look at each trilogy in a very specific lens today. So, Alex, what is our focus for this episode?
Yep, so this is episode 76, the cultural and historical influences on each Skywalker Saga film. So, as we know, the Skywalker Saga, which is the current main canon of movies, obviously supported by the mega franchise of video games and novels and comics and pinball machines and strange lore dumps kept on Wikipedia. So that's the Star Wars universe. But there are 9 movies, as well as 2 spin-offs, that really do make the primary canon of Star Wars and supported by all the rest of it. And
Mhm.
each of these was released as a trilogy. The original trilogy, which was released A New Hope in 1977, The Empire Strikes Back in 1980, and The Return of the Jedi in 1983. Full disclosure, that is a full 10 to 15 years before Connor and I were alive. So we are getting the cultural context for that trilogy secondhand or by osmosis. And then there was the prequel trilogy, which was also released one every 3 years. The Phantom Menace in 1999, The Attack of the Clones in 2002, and Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith in 2005. And then finally, 10 years after that, we have the sequel trilogy called The Force Awakens in 2015, The Last Jedi in 2017, and The Rise of Skywalker in 2019. So, as we can see, there are 16 years between the end of the original trilogy and the start of the prequel trilogy, and then 10 years between the end of the prequel trilogy and the start of the sequel trilogy. Still quite a long period of time between those, but slightly less between the prequel and sequel trilogies. But all that said, each trilogy of movies came out influenced by the cultural and historical events surrounding the release of the movies, as well as understood by those who were acting in and making them.
So, I think just to quickly touch on the original trilogy, because again, we're looking at this information secondhand, and I think really from even from the horse's mouth of George Lucas himself. That's to simply put it, the original trilogy is a reflection of the Vietnam War that took place all throughout the 60s through the 80s, where, and this could be my take that's personal and not exactly correct, but it's almost as though the sides here are flipped, and we are taking a look at the side of the rebellion, the side of what would be Vietnam as the actual protagonists of this story, with the militarized empire being their foe. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but I I just getting that sense of uh, where the motivations are between each side kind of points to that possibility.
Yeah. Some people might point to Star Wars as a quintessential tale of good and evil. And while it can be seen through that lens, I think that could be somewhat reductive. There is our protagonists are plucky freedom fighters called terrorists by their opponents, fighting against an empire that literally calls their primary infantry stormtroopers. So there is both the influence of the Vietnam War, and then World War II itself was in the living memory, if not of those acting or producing Star Wars, then in their parents. It was in the World War II movie was a thing, and it's still a thing, but was an entire genre back in the 70s and early 80s. And Star Wars is openly grappling with the history of cinema as well as the cultural context that it was released in.
Visually, aesthetically, when we have like direct design correlations between the empire and the Nazi Party, just taking a look at how the um, even like especially when we get to the sequel trilogy, how that is represented in modern day culture and sort of embraced by some of those who we may find less than savory.
Yeah, I'll definitely want to compare the differences in the how the evil is in the First Order compared to the Empire. But yes, the original trilogy, a conscious reflection on Vietnam. And if people have watched Star Wars and did not come away with the theme that imperialism is bad, then listen to one of our episodes on media literacy, I suppose. But yes, Star Wars firmly comes down on the side, even if it's a little bit milk toast at times, a little bit less incisive than a film with a sharper point to it. I mean, Star Wars is kind of like you go, guys know the fascists are evil and imperialism is bad, right? We're not even gonna like really like show that to you in all great detail. You just kind of know that.
Mhm.
Andor is kind of the only Star Wars media that really grapples deeply with that subject on more than just a assumed surface level, but it's there.
Yeah,
So
the world in which the rebellion fights against the Empire is very black and white, literally in some cases, um, in so much that we don't question, the Empire is, you know, they're the baddies, correct? So, um, yeah, it's kind of like a simpler take on war because I don't know if George Lucas was trying to make any grand sweeping political statements back in the 70s and 80s. I think he was probably more focused on trying to tell a fable, a myth, fantasy in a science fiction environment. Definitely with the war backdrop and with especially the dogfights, the physical action is very reminiscent of World War II air combat. Um, in fact, George Lucas, as a placeholder when the special effects weren't ready, spliced in footage from the 1940s in order to give the editors an idea of how to put together those special effects sequences.
yeah, and I think this also says how Lucas was also aware of the history of cinema he was writing in that he pioneered so many um, storytelling devices, but also visual effects in a way that was not possible before Star Wars, and that many works have imitated and built on afterwards, from the opening shot of the Star Destroyer to uh, the attempted realism with the original lightsabers and all of that. But another point that I would like to, I think, what was more of a conscious choice is there is exactly one important non-human character in the A New Hope, and that is Chewbacca. And I guess you could make the argument for the droids, but we'll say living flesh and blood character. But as we get further on in the original trilogy, and definitely by the time we get to Return of the Jedi, the rebellion has become self, consciously more and openly more multicultural. We
Mhm.
have the Mon Cala with Admiral Akbar. We have Nia Nub, the Sullustan, who is Lando's co-pilot in the Millennium Falcon, diving into the core of the new Death Star. We have the Ewoks serving as a pivotal part in defeating the Empire, and they're straight up an indigenous species resisting being dominated by a technologically superior imperialist enemy. The parallels between American Manifest Destiny kind of writes itself. So I think that is another aspect we need to acknowledge is that, I mean, every major, both imperial and non-imperial character in A New Hope, other than the cantina scene, is human. But then by the time we get to The Empire Strikes Back, we have more aliens in Cloud City. We have the Wampa. We still don't see any non-human characters really in Echo Base, even though they canonically were there. It's just like, oh, we're just going to show all the Twi'leks and Deveronians that were actually part of the rebellion. And books have placed them there at that time. But then look at the massive shift in Return of the Jedi. We're in Jabba's palace. There's, Boba Fett's human, and there's some couple other humans, but we have um, the Major Domo, Bib Fortuna, who is a Twi'lek. We have Jabba the Hutt, who is a Hutt. So part of this is, I think, the increase in costuming as
Mhm.
an ability to do this, but I think it is also a conscious reflection of trying to depict using the secondary setting and the speculative elements of Star Wars in that there are aliens to say something about the benefits and challenges of multiculturalism.
And you see which side of the conflict doesn't have aliens? That'd be the fascist empire, who uh, I think throughout this trilogy and the sequel trilogy, we have nothing but humans working for the empire. We've talked at length about how Grand Admiral Thrawn is singular, that he's one of the very few alien members of the empire. Just what's the excuse here? Is it all just so that they don't have to mass produce different stormtrooper armor variations? No, uh, it's reflective of racism. We don't
Yeah.
necessarily deal with that at a face conflict, but it's something that's definitely a subtle inclination that the rebellion values something uh, much more multicultural and diverse than the empire.
Yes, and this is Star Wars saying different cultures are good. Having multiple viewpoints is good. If you're a
Mhm.
singular viewpoint with only one type of person, that's bad. The only primary black character in the original trilogy is also joins the rebellion.
Mhm.
So, though I should not, I mean, it's canonically, I know Anakin is, based on Hayden Christensen, and um, I was acted physically by a white man, but James Earl Jones is black. So let's
Mhm.
acknowledge his contribution to the original Star Wars
Mhm.
trilogy as well. But all that said, it is canonical that Palpatine, while himself, I mean, he would say he's not bigoted. He's probably bigoted, but
Mhm.
he is a person in power, seizing control, and to maintain control of his bureaucratic fascist empire, he stoked nationalist and xenophobic tendencies. Um, hey, I wonder where Lucas got the idea to portray a character who used nationalism and xenophobia to prop
Mhm.
up their empire. Um, and I'm not just saying that he'd be critical of the US, though that is where George Lucas obviously grew up. But you can look at empires throughout history, from the Roman Empire to China to the British Empire, to yeah, where nationalism, xenophobia, or a mix of the two is often used in context to keep a dictator in place.
Yeah, and as a bit of a, I guess, transition into our next trilogy, in discussing the prequels, we see that Palpatine takes this sort of view against the Jedi and views them as a singular force of evil that needs to be extinguished in the galaxy, which, you replace the word Jedi with something else, and it's, again, harkens back to fascism and World War II.
Yeah. Yeah, so finishing off the original trilogy, rising out of the post-Vietnam War period, prior to the existence of sort of a online monoculture that we'll talk about when we get to the sequel trilogy, and then acknowledging increased globalism and multiculturalism still present through better technology and movement of peoples into the 80s, shown in Return of the Jedi. If not making a statement on it, at least using fiction to acknowledge that, hey, this is a world where lots of different people mix, and that's going to be depicted in my fantasy sci-fi epic. So then we go 16 years into the future. George Lucas goes into his 50s and 60s, um, when he's making the prequel trilogy. And we get a very different tone and a very different context within which we are releasing these um, films. The internet becomes widely available in like 2004 to 2005 and really popular about 2007. So the prequel trilogy is still pre, internet culture as we know it today,
Mhm.
but you're getting the tech era is here. I mean, the .com bubble was early 2000s when the prequels are starting to come out. So, Connor, we actually were alive during this period. We were children, but still alive. So, what is your thought? Um, there's obviously a couple big world events that happen that are going
Mhm.
to both to a pre and post era for the context within which these movies are being made.
So living through the movies, I don't recall drawing the illusions between current events and what I was seeing on screen in retrospect. And with, popular discourse, it's easy to see where George Lucas was inspired. Um, in terms of a political nature, things aren't strictly black and white. We are not on the opposing side of an invasion, nor are we going up against a force that is just outright, definitively evil. We are a little bit morally gray. Our Jedi are not exactly effective. Their views aren't the most sorry, word,
Flexible.
flexible, progressive. They're kind of an archaic group, and we have a republic who, on the surface is the good guys. These are the ones who are fighting the enemies, the separatists. But we all know who's in charge of the republic, and it's not exactly clear what the separatists want other than independence. They aren't putting living beings on the front lines of battle, but droids. Um, it's they're uh, dealing with things like taxation and dealing with um, uh, how different groups interact. So this isn't a simple conflict. This isn't a straightforward conflict. This is something that is, I think with it still being a Star Wars, it is a simplified version of actual events, but still a reflection of, hey, the uh, leaders that we put our belief into, perhaps we should be quite selective about.
Yeah, the prequel trilogy was released, during the final days of the Clinton presidency prior to 9/11. But I mean, Lucas gets much more pointed with his illusions. He names one of his antagonists Newt Gunray, who is a um, sleazy, economic focused imperialist, and is fairly openly named after Newt Gingrich, the Republican Speaker of the House from 1995 to 1999, who led the impeachment inquiry against Bill Clinton. So that is like that's not even that's like Newt Gingrich, Newt Gunray. It's not subtext; it's text. We have distrust of authority. We have admiring the ideals of democracy while also the reality of it not living up to anyone's expectations. Procedure and rules being used to block actually helping people in favor of archaic formality. We have, um, hey, a strong, charismatic leader using the levers of power to seize control for himself without any checks and balances to stop him, using the emergency powers granted by a war to seize control of the state. I mean, are you talking about Hitler or Donald Trump or George W. Bush? Take your pick. As far as which U.S. president could be an illusion. And this is not just grappling with U.S. history. It's not the U.S. is not the only people that have strong men who have attempted to subvert democracy. Uh, and it's also much more acknowledging economic disparity as a driving force of human history and trying to grapple with that in Star Wars. We have slavery depicted for the first time. And I just need to establish another one of those things that's Star Wars is pretty firm about. Slavery is bad. Discrimination is bad. Palpatine seizing power was bad, killing all the Jedi. The Jedi might have had their flaws, but also, um, yeah,
Extermination, a massive genocide, bad.
genocide is bad.
Mhm.
So, and then, but economic exploitation of a distant people is bad. Um, Attempting to use a crisis to earn political capital and manufacturing that crisis, that's bad. Imperialism, still bad. So we one of the linchpins of the Phantom Menace is the heroes only win when they're able to reconcile between a indigenous people with their own proud culture who feel looked down on by a more metropolitan and industrialized people with their own vibrant but somewhat superior seeming culture. And it's only by them acknowledging they need each other that they're able to then defeat their enemies who are literally mechanical, soulless monsters.
I don't want to uh, ding the prequel trilogy with false praise because I don't know if one, um, these messages are communicated in the most effective way, or two, the messages are what the fan base was expecting from their pew pew laser battle uh, epic fantasy sci-fi movie. But in some ways, Star Wars has always been just that, but it has also been so much more. It's been so much of a reflection of inspiration of um, this being this melting pot of ideas of different influences from just cultural media, whether we're taking westerns and samurai films and combining those, just like we are with the ideas of science fiction and fantasy. Um, the politics are woven into the prequel trilogy. You can't cut them out. You can't. There is no story around them. The story is one of political manipulation and the systematic takeover of one individual and their rise to power. So I'm not saying that hey, it was fun, but it worked well in reflecting that part of our life and culture.
Yeah, I mean, you can complain about the execution, but it's inclusion. It's like, man, I liked House of Cards except for all the politics. Um, I mean, this is about Palpatine radicalizing a young man and then seizing control of a state. So, I mean, it's inherently political.
Yeah.
Causing a war between, I mean, uh, the Confederation of Independent Systems who don't want to be ruled by an ineffective republic, but then are suborned by powerful outside interest groups for their own gain. It's inherently political. And yeah, I think that is the so the by the time of prequel trilogy, the Cold War is over, the Berlin Wall has fallen. There is no longer this world of black and white and two superpowers who each have their own sphere of influences. You have one superpower left. You have a world. We have Europe getting more prominent, China growing more prominent, economic uncertainty, the rising realization of the costs of climate change. So there's all of those pieces, I think, feeding into this. And then, whereas the original trilogy, I'm not going to say it glorified war, but it's definitely more of like a Guns of Navarone style. Ah, yes, our cool commandos going on their cool mission to blow up this shield generator. The prequel trilogy is like, man, all these clones are getting shot, and then the army turned on the Jedi and killed all of them. It's much more of a distrust of armed forces and state power present, I think, due to the context of the times that the movies are released in and George Lucas's own political views.
So great summation of how Star Wars is kind of used as this vehicle to tell a political story. By the time we get to the sequel trilogy, it's I'm not going to say that politics is absent because it's not, but it's not the most prominently planned uh, aspect of these movies. I think that is a sort of direct response to the general population saying, "Hey, let's not have these movies be about so much politics." But I think that kind of um, doesn't do as much good when it comes to getting a sense of world building and where the Republic is now, because that is inherently interesting. It's interesting and also uh, crucial in understanding the conflict that we have, because this isn't 1970 where we're wowed by the amazing special effects. So many blockbusters have amazing special effects. Uh, we need to see kind of the legacy of where our characters left the world, because they ostensibly defeated the Empire, set up their own republic, and we start The Force Awakens within the next generation's conflict, where we have this resurgence of imperial ideas and strategies making a very firm hold in the galaxy, and we don't really understand how that happened.
Yeah, so this trilogy was the first one produced by a corporation first and individual second. So definitely something to consider. But that says something itself about the context within which the movies were being released. This was the first Disney produced trilogy of Star Wars movies. And you can tell that there is a lack of singular creative vision. Say what you will about both the original and sequel trilogies, or original and prequel trilogies, but hey, you had a through line of creative vision, even if it could have been questioned more at times. You don't really have that in the sequel trilogy. So I think part of that is literally the way it was made is talking about at least the artistic culture present when the movies were released. More focus testing, more concerns about marketable demographics. Not that George Lucas was ever not thinking about how to market his next toy or what
Right.
kids would buy, but now you have the power of one of the largest media corporations in the world backing the
Mhm.
decisions made in this piece of art, which I think had an impact on it.
Mhm. We have the Star Wars global audience. We're not just thinking domestically, but we're thinking about how is this going to play in China? How is this going to play in other countries where the political alignment isn't as similar as it is domestically, which I think has plagued a lot of Marvel movies and having them remain kind of neutral in some political uh, topics. But so what
Yes.
do we get in the sequel trilogy? Where can we draw some connections to real life cultural impact and influence?
Yeah, so definitely it's a trilogy of movies more afraid to make a political statement like fascism bad, though it's still coming down on fascism bad. I mean, we have
Oh yeah, easily.
General Hux giving a Hitler-esque speech to his people while he's about to blow up a planet, while all looking like a Nazi. So that is a deliberate homage, and he thinks he looks cool, but like most fascists, he's actually just kind of a sniveling, whiny asshole.
Mhm.
Uh, but it doesn't. The First Order is more like a radicalized right wing military junta than like the grinding bureaucracy of a soulless state that the Empire was. Um, the First Order relies on unthinking obedience to a set of ideals, whereas the Empire just required obedience to rules and strictures. It had an ideological component, but that was secondary to compliance to state power. So I think if you're looking at a difference, it's sort of the rise of maybe fragmentary ideas or how stronger, you know, the Soviet Union with like its thought control and all that is gone. But hey, even though we don't have like these two superpowers kind of trying to fight each other ideologically, it's like, but we're still getting tons and tons of radicalized people in different causes. It's just now all fragmented. And there's not, and we even see like, oh, and the New Republic itself was kind of ineffective and then is not even a factor.
Mhm.
Part of that is to cast our heroes back in the plucky support role. But part of that is also it is then there are there any is it more of like a personal savior hero story? But even then, the sequel trilogy rejects hero worship too. Luke Skywalker is a disillusioned old man. Um, Han Solo is a disillusioned old man. Lando
Leia's
is a
not a disillusioned old woman, at least.
no.
She's
She's the only
still
one who keeps her
keeping up the fight.
ideology
Mhm.
and keeps up the fight. Yeah, but uh, definitely like a meet your heroes and they might not be what you expect.
Mhm.
So I think there's definitely a even though Leia is herself um, still pursuing her goals, she does not encourage hero worship about herself. She just calls herself general.
Mhm.
She's only princess in certain contexts and she doesn't have a cult of personality about her.
And she's not Jedi Master this or uh, Chancellor that. She's serving a very clear small role and something that I quite enjoy about her. Just she doesn't have that uh, desire to seek out a better life like Luke would, but purely just wants to establish one for the good of the people. Um, that brings to mind. So we have all of these characters acting in response to what's come before, and we have a character we haven't talked about yet, Kylo Ren, who I think this might be a statement that some fans might not like because Kylo Ren's one of the better written characters, but he's a neo-Nazi. He's taking on this ideology of um, horrors past as a means to be intimidating, as a means to demonstrate power, as a means to uh, sort of reclaim something that his predecessors, his ancestors have started, and to complete their work. So, whether that be neo-Nazism or any kind of extremist uh, politic,
Yeah, he's
it's
encouraged. It's the classic like neo-Nazi cult like gang. Like he's encouraged not like Snoke does not encourage him to question his orders. He's supposed to view his enemies as the other. He is obsessed with the trappings of power, like wearing his mask to mark him out as dangerous. Yeah, he's like a neo-Nazi incel.
Mhm. And
Um,
this is the character that we're rooting for in some way, and but we want to root for him in order to redeem himself.
yeah, and he only finds some redemption both in death, but also when he encounters ideas outside of his cult. Um, when Ray is able to finally challenge him and sort of break the illusion of mystique around, and it turns out, man, your friends are just a bunch of racists and like Nazis, man, and they're not cool. They're just lame.
Yeah.
And so he has to see that before he can leave the lame Nazi group that is the First Order.
Mhm. Yeah, he's always trying to push away this more immediate familial connection from his parents. Uh, thinking that, what did they know? I'm going to look back another generation and see these people who are really empowered, really have a sway. Um, and he has to learn that, you know, each generation moves from the past, each generation improves upon the past. And, Darth Vader didn't win in the end. So it stands to reason that trying to emulate him is not going to be effective. So
Yeah,
I think that's the closest that I see Star Wars, the sequel trilogy, trying to make a political statement.
yeah. The strongest political statement is made in, for better or worse, The Last Jedi, when
Mhm.
we stampede a bunch of captive animals through a war profiteering casino. That's not Rian Johnson as much as being subtle as, punching you in the face with his three themes he wanted to get across, which is child labor is bad, war profiteering is bad, and um,
Jedi are
animal
bad.
cruelty animal cruelty is bad.
Mhm.
Those are
Mhm.
his three things, and also a little bit of both sidism about him, where he's like, but also I think some cultural class consciousness, where he's like, yeah, the wealthy don't care if you're first order or resistance; they just profit off of the battle. And I think
Mhm.
it's a little bit reductive to say like, oh yes, all sides in any political situation are inherently equally corrupt.
Is
But
war bad? Yeah.
yeah, is war profiteering bad? Yes. And I
War
think I would
itself is
even,
bad. Yeah.
yeah, I don't think this is even too deliberate of a choice, but I think coming out of it is that we bring Palpatine back as the villain,
Mhm.
which you could
Mhm.
say is either due to lack of creative bankrupting. And I think Palpatine being the villain, even though he was also the villain previously, is like, oh, hey, everybody, we beat racism and imperialism. We're better now. And it's like, no, we haven't.
Mhm.
No, he was like almost either a reaction to or foreshadowing. It's like here's all of the evils of the past, which the optimism of the past said we defeated, and no, it's back here, same old shit. So I think you can do that
Yeah.
as another lens. Anything you want to add as far as the cultural context of the sequels?
I think that it could be a little bit of prediction, but we've allowed this former ruler to return to power, and look how bad that is. You know, uh, based on when the time of this recording, you'll see what I mean by that. But otherwise, I think that much like any kind of influence that Star Wars draws from, politics is one side of it, and it's something that doesn't just harken back to our sort of mythology of old, but it's a reflection of what's going on today. And it's why Star Wars is such a fantastic delivery mechanism for uh, all sorts of different kinds of concepts.
Well, that is our immediate thoughts on the cultural context. Obviously, we could go much more in depth, but we want to provide an overview of where we think the themes and context of each of the Skywalker Saga trilogies are coming from. Do leave us your own thoughts at our subreddit at reddit.com/r/talking Star Wars, or follow us or like our videos wherever you see them.
We'll see you sometime soon in a galaxy right here.